I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that reduces the risk and costs of cross-border transactions. As a board member, there are few better feelings than making a suggestion which adds quick material value to your organisation. I remember when one of our board members saved us $50,000 with a quick introduction to a group discount scheme for one of our key suppliers. I continue to feel grateful to this day. Alt21 can offer exactly this kind of quick win for board members. By using their foreign exchange and hedging services, you could reduce your company's costs by 90%. For a company that has just 10 million foreign exchange exposure through its revenues or cost base, that could be over 300,000 back into the business. Alt21 are so confident that they offer the best value in the market. They show you how much they make from fees in real time before and after any transaction. If you want to save your organisation money on its foreign exchange and hedging, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with NewRoll, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of NewRoll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Ian Phillips, is the author of How to Be a Great GoaT, a guide for school and college governors and trustees. He is chair of Watling Park Primary and runs Clew Education, which provides governance consultancy and support. He's also a governor of a primary school federation and a trust member of 3 academy trusts. He also sits on independent panels reviewing permanent exclusions and chairs complaints panels. Formerly, he was chair of Woodhouse College, Dulles Primary School, and Squires Lane Learning Federation. Ian, a huge welcome and thank you for being here.
And thank you very much for inviting me, Ollie.
Ian, I came across you after someone recommended your fabulous book, GoaT, which clearly distills your extensive wisdom and experience into a very accessible read. I was having a conversation with my wife the other day who had been approached about becoming a governor and for the first time showed some interest in what I do. And I guided her to some of the episodes in the podcast we've had in the past. Jen Baxter in episode 32, Mary Cook in episode 16, Clarissa Farr in episode 43, and Julius Weinberg in episode 24. But it struck me there's been a long time since we've done a real deep dive into the role of a trustee. And so I thought you would be a brilliant person to take us through that. And so I'd be keen if you could imagine, I'm someone who's never had a governor or trustee role before, but has just been approached by a school to become a governor. And I'm considering taking on the role because I've heard these are rewarding roles to do and good for my development. Before I do, though, I've got a few questions. And I'd love it if you could summarize for me and explain for me, what does the role involve?
Thanks, Ollie. Well, before I answer that, let me try and say what's great about it, if I may, because working as a volunteer in education is unfailingly optimistic. It's about creating the right environment for teachers to weave their magic and help kids along their journey, wherever they are, towards the next stage in their education. And schools, as many of our listeners will have read, are in pretty deep financial straits. And you sit around the table with people you might never interact with in your normal course of life. Professionals, educators, NGO execs, SME owners, local politicians. So it's always a fertile ground for discussion and debate. It normally takes the form of 4 board meetings a year, and if my experience is anything to go by, a number of committee meetings as well. Quite a lot of pre-reading. You'll get a pack of dozens and dozens of pages, which you can only really add value to a meeting if you've immersed yourself in them before you turn up. I personally prefer face-to-face meetings to online stuff. I think the chemistry is far better, decision-making is better, and the experience is more, in my view, pleasurable. Our schools, particularly state schools I'm talking about, I've done all my work only in state schools, and typically in schools with fairly high deprivation indices and high levels of English as an additional language. So I'm a governor at a federation of 2 schools in leafy London NW11, but 85% of our kids don't speak English at home. 85%. So it gives you an idea of the shifting tides of the demography in our state-funded schools. And our schools, along with many others, are in financial straits. The ability to break even is fundamentally compromised by the fact that per capita funding is stagnated and expenses are not, particularly people costs. So if you go into a typical state-funded primary school, you'll be looking at well north of 80% of income being spent on people, which doesn't leave much headroom for all the other stuff that goes on in a school. And when you sit on a board, you have to confront that and you have to ask the sort of existential questions. Is how we are structured the best way forward? And if not, how do we determine what it is and how the hell do we get there? And it really doesn't matter what background you come from. But nevertheless, when you're looking at finances, you've got to understand that if the expenses number is higher than the income number, you've got trouble. And you don't need to be a mathematician or a nuclear physicist or anything to understand that dynamic is essentially terminal. And sitting around the table and discussing these things is exciting. It's thrilling because you know you've got an obligation to do what's best for the learners who've been entrusted to you and to the staff who've invested their working lives in you, which is a huge commodity and you have to value that.
Are there archetypal board member profiles that you think are most needed?
I mean, every board that I know of does what's called a skills audit virtually every year, at least, if not more, saying, what are the skills we've got? What are the skills we need? And you recruit against those skills gaps. It's not always easy. Volunteers aren't very thick on the ground. It's time consuming, and we'll probably touch upon that later. I think it's a noble thing and incredibly rewarding in a number of ways. In terms of archetype, you always have to have one or two financially qualified people on the board. Absolutely essential. I always like to have a lawyer. I like to have someone who can interrogate educational data from the inside of the profession, which I can't do. And as with anything, when you encounter these for the first time, you encounter a forest of acronyms, which are replicated and repeated in every head teacher's report you'll ever see. And you can't always remember them all, stroke, if any. And you have to learn. It's like learning, in some ways, a new language. I introduced at Woodhouse a glossary so that new governors could sit and think, what the hell are they talking about? Oh, that's what that means, without actually having to admit they're ignorant, which some people are uncomfortable doing. It's always, I think, good to have an HR professional on the board because invariably there will be people issues. When you spend so much money on your people, there's going to be high levels of stress. There's going to be maternity issues that will need to be covered. There will be disciplinary. There will be grievances. There will be complaints. I always like to have business people on there who can bring a different skill set saying, well, this is where we are. You can see where you're going. The projections aren't great. What do we do about it? And I've always found that having someone who runs their own business as well as being an employee in a big business brings another perspective, which is valuable because they can sympathize or empathize with the head teacher who's effectively like a CEO.
You haven't mentioned real estate or digital, which are two that I often associate as being critical archetypes for school boards.
Okay, so the reason I wasn't completely an oversight, but if you're a local authority school, the real estate will be owned by the local authority. And if you've got issues, you would expect them, providing they've got the money, which is a big caveat, to step in if there's an immediate crisis. If you're talking about a building development, then you could, because they own the land or have control of the land under a long lease, and the same applies to a multi-academy trust, which will take on the control of the land of the schools they absorb. Digital, I think that's coming more slowly, principally because the schools that I work in, don't have a lot of budget to migrate to AI or digital footprint as quickly as they might like. Often, when I think about the role of governors, you have to distinguish between those who are firefighters, those who are architects, those who are civil engineers, if you like. And there are those of us on the pessimism scale who are quite happy putting out fires. And there are others who are more interested in building now, whether it's capability in AI or whatever it might be. I think it will become a more pressing issue, but at the moment, local authority schools are strapped for cash. and multi-academy trusts. So at the trust level, they may well be employing AI gurus and digital people who would then cascade across the trust as they learn what works and what doesn't. It's just trying to operate the pace of change within a school which is tied for cash, maybe competing for pupils. It suddenly doesn't take as high a priority than perhaps history will tell us that it should have done.
So coming back to then our listener who is trying to assess whether these roles are for them, what questions should they be asking interviewers when determining whether to take on a role?
Okay, I think that I would ask them, first of all, what is it you want from someone with my skills and experience? How can I add value to the deliberations of the board? Because what you don't want to do is sit there and not feel you're adding value. You're taking up a chair that might have a more productive person sitting on it, and you will be miserable. And if it's not a rich and rewarding experience, and I've talked to a number of governors who are disenchanted, I say, well, then don't do it. Go, if you want to volunteer, go and find something else. Go and work in a hospital or a soup kitchen or whatever. But if you're not getting something out of it, don't do it. And I think a prospective governor or a trustee needs to know what they can add in order for what they can understand they're going to get out of it. They should also ask about the state of the school. And I mean by that two particular metrics. One, how do its outcomes compare with schools with similar cohorts? In other words, are they on the top of the pile? Are they perilously near the bottom of the pile? And what are their ambitions to move up the pile?
And can you just expand on that? Because for those not familiar with this idea of cohorts, could you just expand on what you mean by that?
So cohort is, what are the students like? What are the learners like in this school? What is their deprivation? What is their ethnic breakdown? What is their English as an additional language breakdown? We look in schools at national comparisons, but the school that I'm a governor of, 85% of the kids don't speak English at home. What is the point of comparing their performance with a primary school, with the data set that has primary schools in Cumbria, Cornwall and Norfolk, where English as an additional language does not exist or exists in minute percentages? There is none. I want to know, how is my school comparing with that school down the road or in that London borough or in that metropolitan authority that has all these kids who are on pupil premium, they would qualify for free school meals, and English is not their first language. You know, in the school, some of the schools that I've worked in, we have taken kids in who've come over on small boats, who don't understand the concept of school, don't understand the concept even of queuing, don't understand any of those concepts, and yet they are included in our data later on at year 6 when they exit and they do what are called Key Stage 2 SAPs. So how do we measure our performance without those comparators? And the same applies at Key Stage 4, which is GCSEs, and Key Stage 5, which is A-levels or their vocational equivalents.
Okay, so when you're thinking about asking about the state of the school, is how do I compare outcomes for different school cohorts? And what was the second part?
And the second metric is, what are your finances like? Do you have reserves? Do you have a deficit? Is your deficit episodic or structural? In other words, you can have a budget to break even, but if a teacher goes off long-term sick and you have to bring in a supply from an agency, it's going to blow your budget. That is not a structural deficit. The structural deficit is when you know that your costs are going to be greater than your income, and your ability to influence that income is negligible.
So what are the answers to those questions that would make you advise someone not to take that role?
I think that if I detected complacency in the outcomes, or worse, an ignorance of comparable cohorts, if they say, well, we've got a good quality of education, but I don't know what others do, I would be nervous unless my skill set was such that I'm good at extirpating complacency. So if I've been in a business where, let's say it was family-owned engineering business that was happy to be number 3 and had no aspirations to be number 2, but had numbers 4, 5 and 6 creeping up on them, and the leadership did nothing, then that would be a comparison that would make me nervous. I think if they admit there's a deficit, but seem not to worry about it. You see, in a local authority school, the local authority will pay the payroll. So you're in this sort of situation where if you looked at the P&L, you would see there's a really significant deficit year on year and a hideous cumulative one. But if the local authority, and this is where it's not a limited company where the bank might withdraw any facilities, if the local authority continues to pay payroll and pay other bills, there is a kind of moral hazard that we saw in 2008 with the banking sector, where actually I can carry on teaching these schools, working in these schools, and leading them, because in the end, the local authority is not going to pull the plug because it has to find places for all those children. It has a statutory obligation to do so. So if I was meeting head teacher and governors who are actually quite blasé about it, I would think I can't add value there. And I know chairs who've said to local authorities, look, this is a small primary school. It's a one-form entry. They don't come smaller in towns and cities. The costs of running it are always going to be greater than our per capita funding. I'm always going to run it at a deficit. If you don't want that, you close it and relocate the children, because in the end, that is the only sanction that a local authority has within reason. And they just called their bluff. They played chicken, and the local authority accepted that it needed a school in that locale, and the price of that was a permanent deficit. What can I do as a governor? Would I want to be a governor of that school? No, I wouldn't.
But I suppose if you take that scenario where you've got a situation where the board have accepted there is a deficit and there's nothing they can do about it, and it's the local education authority's decision on whether they close it down or not, am I to understand that you think you can't add any value in that deficit situation? I would have thought there are still other areas that as a board you can add value, and it's not predicated on being out of the deficit.
There can, but they are going to be on the fringes. I mean, there will be people listening to this who've got significant experience in their extracurricular lives of, let's say, fundraising, of developing a PTA or going out and getting corporate sponsorship that might come in and being able to twist arms. And I know organizations that offer that service. I know individuals that can do it, and that might work for them. But if you asked me about archetypes before, I think the archetypal governor wants to go in and help improve schools, help them, as I said, attain sustainable stability, and not be looking over their shoulders. And, a bit of background, when I became a governor in 2002, these were halcyon days where the Blair government gave us year-on-year funding, and we didn't bat an eyelid. And we could afford to put up, in that time, 2 brand new buildings at Woodhouse. Big buildings that improved our capacity and improved the facilities for our kids. And it was great. And then 2008 came, and suddenly the plug is well and truly pulled. And suddenly your expenses are going up, but that income is not tracking it at all. And so in my formative years as a governor, it was fairly cushy. But then I had to help the board steer the school through this whole new financial paradigm from which we are yet to emerge, if truth be told.
Can we move on to talk about the role of the head teacher? I'm really interested to hear how you think about that relationship with the head teacher, which in a commercial organization is the CEO.
Yeah. But it can get fraught, and it can be unbelievably fruitful. And I wish there was a hard and fast rule that one could share that said this is how it always is. But head teachers are individuals. A number of them may well have been in post for a long period of time. Others move on, some retire, and finding a new head teacher is the single most challenging role of a governing board of trustees for the trust, or for its individual schools, standalone boards for their own given institution. And I've done quite a few of them. I love it if you get it right. Hate it if it goes wrong. And I've seen it go wrong, although thankfully not under my aegis. And that sounds arrogant. I must have been lucky. The thing about head teachers is you've got to remember, they all started life as teachers. And when they did their degrees and PGCEs, they never dreamed of running a whole school. effectively is the CEO of a social enterprise where they're not just responsible for academic standards, but for the entire shooting match. I've known head teachers in fairly old buildings who've had to go into playground and unblock drains because they're short of staff and the playground's flooded and there's no one else to do it. That's not what they signed up for, but they recognise someone had to do it. If not them, who?
What are the metrics you use to assess a head teacher's performance once they're in role?
So, again, it will depend on the circumstances of the school, but generally speaking, number one, have they adhered to their KPIs, which are going to revolve around academic outcomes at whatever key stage that school delivers them, and any other external metrics measured against external norms. So, for example, in primary school, the young kids at Key Stage 1 do a phonics exercise and a multiplication tables exercise. Now, we know what they should be getting, even though we're measuring them internally. Key Stage 2, GCSEs, A-levels, they're all externally validated. So you've got those. If I think of Woodhouse, we'll look at a percentage of our students going to university, and within that percentages of Russell Group, Oxbridge Medical School, Dental School. They're metrics that appeal to our parents and our students. We will look at the percentage of grades at the top level and a percentage of overall passes. So those sorts of things which are unarguable.
Do you have any leading indicators? Because by the time you got to that point, it's too late for the kids.
You've got to remember that educational institutions roll from year to year. So head teachers, principals, they're looking at, am I going to hit my budget this year? Am I going to get our targeted outcomes? And then we would do an appraisal in the autumn and change them for that current academic year. In terms of leading metrics, I think the only one really is applications for the following year, and which gives you enough time, hopefully, to try loosely marketing campaigns if you're lagging behind what you want to be. But this is a reactive sector, Ollie.
You don't track pupil or staff engagement?
No, we do satisfaction surveys, but to my mind, they are quite performative. We're doing them because we're meant to do them, not because necessarily we pour into them and look for trends. Some don't.
Are those annual surveys or pulse surveys?
Annual.
Okay. So it always strikes me as strange and more organizations don't use pulse surveys, so they have a sort of continuous feeling of the pulse across their stakeholders.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of governors and trustees is the extent to which you factor into your behaviours the health and well-being of the head teacher and how you manage their workload, and they in turn manage the workload of their reports to make sure that we are not doing them emotional damage by piling too much on them. If you're facing what looks like financial oblivion, you can't always take care of the emotional well-being, and stress levels in schools are high for teachers. They're high for head teachers as well. It's an awesome responsibility. So I think one has to take a measured approach.
You may already have some board roles, but feel like you've plateaued. New Role Plus gives you personal expert advice to move forwards, refining your board offer, strengthening your position on fast-changing topics like AI, and expanding your access to more aspirational roles. Head to plus.newrole.com to find out more. It's interesting that you think about having data like that as being heavy-handed. I mean, the way I think about it in a commercial setting, at least, is that it's enabling. It means we can sit around together and look at it, and we can plan more effectively because we've got a shared picture of what's happening. But the educational institutions that I've been involved with in different ways, I've always struggled to get that mindset embedded. And it strikes me as fascinating. Why is it so difficult in an education environment? And I think the best explanation I've sort of managed to muster is that they're just so time stressed and stretched that there is no room for innovation and or testing new things. Innovation, there's lots of innovation happening, but there's limited appetite for taking risks on new things that are very different from the status quo.
I think that's true. You hit upon half of the issue, which is the sheer time constraints. I mean, everybody talks about the holidays that teachers have, but the fact is that many of them during term time will be working evenings and weekends. They'll be marking, they'll be planning the next week's lessons or whatever it might be. It's this illusion that they go home at 4:00 on a Friday and they don't do anything till Monday when the kids arrive. It's complete cobblers, frankly, which is a technical governance term. If you've been in a school as a governor or a trustee or as a paid member of staff, you have any conception of the challenges that these schools face in terms of managing behaviour. Attendances post-COVID has been dreadful. We have noticed in some of the primary schools, kids at the age of 9 are still in nappies, and teachers are having to spend an hour or two a week cleaning these kids. I mean, it's grotesque. I work in a 12-school multi-academy trust. I chair one of their schools, and they've been going for 10 years. And in the last month, they've had to permanently exclude 2 primary school children, one in year 6, one in year 2, because their behaviour was just unbearable. They could not be in class. And the year 2 child was actually in the school I chair. He had to go into some form of alternative provision where there's 1-to-1, 1-to-3 care. I was with the head teacher doing one of her assessments when she was called out, and this boy had completely, year 2, so that's 7 years old. He'd completely trashed the classroom, injuring 3 classes and driving all 29 children out into the hall because it wasn't safe. Just extrapolate that out to that teaching day. They've lost an hour's lesson. That has to be caught up. They've had to reset the classroom. And the head teacher came back into her room in tears because they'd spent one day of half term getting it ready for a new teacher to come in. And multiply that over schools, all the classes within schools. And you get an idea of not just the time toll, but the emotional toll it takes. So to go and say to them, okay, we're going to do a pulse survey now, and it's going to be this, and we're going to have to analyze the data. I can understand how it would take a particular type of organization to say, at this stage, it's worth doing. When every school is undersubscribed, so you would want the head teacher, if they got bandwidth, to think about how do we get kids who've put down as a 2nd, 3rd or 4th preference to join us in September? What do we have to do to reach out to them, to bring them into school, give them cupcake, give them a bit of playtime or whatever it might be? That's where I would want my head teacher to be spending any extra spare time, because having a full cohort has a dramatic effect on our finances. And I can't tell you what the class break even is. I've never done that metric. But if we bring in 1 extra child, that's an extra £5,000 we're going to get for no additional overhead. So if we can bring in 20 kids, so let's say 3 a year over the 7 years of a primary school, we've put £100 essentially on our bottom line that we can contribute to whatever it might be, whatever the head teacher thinks we ought to spend it on.
Could I play devil's advocate on that? Because it strikes me there's 2 different ways of approaching that. The way you've outlined, if I understood properly, is you'd allocate that marginal resource to effectively marketing, to bringing in more pupils to fill your role so that you can address the financials. I guess there are some organizations in the commercial world which could completely sort of don't spend anything on marketing, and they take the view, let's focus on the product. Let's make the product brilliant, so brilliant that people talk about it, so we don't need to do marketing. And so is there a world where that head teacher instead, if they did that pulse survey and they spent the time really understanding the children dynamics and the teacher dynamics in a different way to what they already do, might create a better offering that would then naturally do the marketing for them? What have I missed?
I think what you're positing is a scenario where you do the work and word of mouth does the rest. And It can work. If you were an outstanding school, like Woodhouse is an outstanding college and is permanently oversubscribed because it's in the lingua franca of 14, 15, 16-year-old kids who are thinking where they want to do their academic A-levels in North London. And it's been there for many years and is not necessarily demography specific, but a primary school, particularly where I am, where the number of primary school children has dipped because of the birth rate, you are competing against a number of schools. And the question is, does that scenario, assuming the data from the Pulse was sufficiently rich, is that in itself enough to trigger the kind of beneficial competitive environment where we could get more students? And I'm not convinced. When you're dealing with kids who don't speak English at home, the requirement you are placing, I'm talking particularly at primary and at year 6, year 7 transition from primary to secondary, you're putting a burden on parents whose English may not be very good to understand what you're saying to them and for them to translate that into a wish to come to our school rather than another one.
Are school boards, in your experience, doing enough to address the shift in the landscape that they're facing? Because you've talked a lot about this challenge of English as an additional language, and I guess, some schools might continue to try and operate a school as they always did. But given the landscape has changed so dramatically, I mean, your example there, I guess, is extreme with 85% of the children not having English as their first language. But it feels to me that you'd need a fundamental shift in your model. If the equivalent thing happened in a commercial environment, you would have a complete change of how you were going about tackling that problem.
I think there will be shining examples of schools that have got it right. I think I read something about a school in Newham that effectively turned itself into a community hub where parents could come in, even with toddlers or babies in arms, and there'd be coffee, they could sit and talk, they could improve their English. And I'd be very keen to do that in my schools. We should be doing it. Short answer, every school should be doing that if they can find the wherewithal to do it within very tight budgets. And I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but certainly would love for that to happen in all our schools. And we should be welcoming people, and many do, a number do, not as many as should be, because I think everyone should be doing it.
You said the boards employ the head teacher, not the other way around. Can you expand on that for those listening who are not familiar with that dynamic?
Okay, so I'm afraid you're now going to get a homespun theory here, Ollie, and I apologise to everybody listening if they think it's a pile of toot. But in our formative years, our first 10 years, there are two remote authority figures that we encounter. There's whoever leads the house of worship to which your parents take you, and there's the head teacher in your primary school. And they are up there somewhere. You don't engage enormously with them, but they are the source of all power within that institution. And by and large, they're not used to being challenged, but that's by the way. When you're a governor or a trustee, you actually recruit them, you employ them. And I've come across a number of governors who don't quite get their head round that and think that the head teacher is still this remote authority figure that they recognize from their infancy and is not to be challenged. I'll give you one example. I sit on panels that review permanent exclusions. If a child is excluded and the parents aren't happy that governors have approved that decision, they can appeal to an independent panel. And I sit on there as a governor rep. And I know that governors have gone in to the first committee where they're reviewing the head teacher's decision and said, I don't care what I hear, I'm backing the head teacher. And I find that morally reprehensible because their role is not to do that. It's to make sure that the head teacher has got it right and has made the right judgment based on statutory guidance and what is morally appropriate. I should add as an aside, I've done quite a number of these, and in every single one, bar one, the school got it wrong and the governors got it wrong. And the panel sent it back to the school to reconsider. We are all flawed. if you build the right team, our flaws mesh into some sort of jigsaw where the picture is full and whole. But individuals will make mistakes. Their judgments will be flawed. And as a governor, you have to accept that your head teacher is mortal and fallible. And you have to maintain distance. So when I put that quite early on in the book, it was meant to be as stark as it could be, that when you're sitting around that table and the head teacher is saying things with which you don't agree, you must speak up. Even if it's only to let the head teacher show you convincingly why you're wrong.
I'm fascinated by the fact that so few of those exclusion panels got it right, in your view. Was that a failure of people speaking up, or how do you analyze that? And how does someone listening to this who might find themselves on an exclusion panel one day learn from that experience?
A head teacher can exclude for one of two reasons. Either the student has carried out a persistent breach of the school's behaviour policy, or they've carried out a single serious breach of the school's behaviour policy. That's limb one. And limb two is that for that student to remain in the school pose a serious risk of harm to their educational welfare or to that of other learners or indeed staff. And you've got to satisfy both those tests. And it's got to be either a persistent breach or a serious breach. Now, the very first one I did, which has haunted me, this was a boy in year 8 who'd arrived from primary school with a diagnosis of alopecia and had been teased mercilessly since he joined the school. And despite parents saying they'd complained, nothing had happened. And in the second term of his second year, he lost it. And I think, and it thumped a child and then went back and thumped them again. And I think this was the child who had been one of those showing pictures of him around the school with the caption, "This is what a cancer patient looks like." And the head teacher excluded him for a single serious breach of the policy. So it's just the attack. He called it an assault, but just the assault and nothing more. And then the governors, this was a school within a faith-based multi-academy trust. And the school had a panel of 3 governors, local governors, and they upheld the decision. And the panel, who consisted of a lay chair, a head teacher, and myself as a serving and experienced governor, we read all the papers. There were a couple of 100 pages of them. And it emerged pretty quickly that the second test had not been applied and the governors hadn't asked about it. And the head teacher made a mistake, in my view, of trying to tap dance and said, well, I did speak to a number of students who were nervous about him coming back. And we said, did you write down those statements? Were they signed and dated, and were they shown to the governors? And did the governors ask about the second limb? And it was patently clear that they hadn't. So the decision was essentially void. They hadn't applied the test. And we said, we're quashing it, and you're going to have to reconsider. I would have liked us to have had the power to quash and reinstate, but the government doesn't allow us to do that. And this was an example where this child had been essentially abandoned by the school. He has to wear a hair system, and if that gets wet, you can see all the webbing and all that sort of stuff. And they didn't even vary their uniform policy to allow him to wear a hood. So a teacher who saw him with a hood after his hair system got wet went up and pulled it down. We were furious, absolutely furious. And if they wanted to get almost everything wrong, they managed to do it quite triumphantly, frankly.
In listening to you talk, you've brought to life what a incredibly stimulating and important role this is, that is both life-changing and hugely impactful on so many lives. Time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round.
Oh, no.
Where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response,
Okay.
if you're ready. Best book every board member should read, and why?
How to Be a Great GoaT. I mean, what else would I answer, Ollie? But the reason I wrote it is there was nothing else out there that did what it does. And I think if you read it, you understand the role very quickly. That's why I wrote it to be very short. I wanted to be the same length as Communist Manifesto, but without the jokes. That was kind of the brief I set myself. And, there may be other books out there. There are lots of school governance handbooks, but they talk about process. This talks about the guts of the job and what you have to be like.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
People who turn up without reading the documents and then ask questions that are answered by them.
Your favorite quote?
I think it's one from the lead lawyer, David Boies, in the Clinton administration's antitrust suit against Microsoft, where he said something along these lines. The more complicated an issue is, the more important it is that you state your simple truths. And when I'm thinking about a restructuring of a school, I think, what are our simple truths, which is we need to get to there. And you can surround it with complexity, but in the end, you state your simple truths and you keep going back to them when you hit a roadblock.
Your most significant professional insight?
One of the things I realized when I joined a board is that when you do it, you embrace a hierarchy of loyalties, and you have to sort out what that hierarchy is and keep referring back to it in moments of difficulty or stress. So when I join a school, at the top of my hierarchy is the children, the students whose future has been entrusted to us at any given time in their educational journey. And after almost the same level of hierarchy as the staff who've invested their working lives. Everything else is subservient to that. And that hierarchy, which I've applied in other areas, is, I think, what stands me in good stead.
Worst professional advice you ever received?
I was told once that I should follow the norm, even though it wasn't suited to the organization's needs. So I was looking for a new head teacher for a single academy trust that I talked about before, whose board was riven. And they had fantastic acting head who was steeped in primary education, but the organization needed an entrepreneurial CEO. And I was told you had to appoint someone who had primary school experience. But I looked at the organization and decided they would come in and impose their own views of pedagogy, when in fact the pedagogy was working. We needed organizational heft. And so I ignored that advice, and it was terrible advice. And I found someone who was absolutely brilliant.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I think it's not to be grateful for any volunteer, not to sort of someone comes along and you hurl yourself and circle their knees with gratitude. You need to be certain they can add value, given where the institution is. And if you're not, then you have to say, actually, we don't have your shaped hole on the board at the moment, but when we do, we'd like to come back to you, please.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I've been chair at Woodhouse for a term, and when the long-standing principal announced she was going to retire. Now, you can make of that what you will as far as my chairing skills are concerned. We went through a process and appointed her deputy to the substantive lead role, and so we had to fill his deputy role. And I delegated to them the specification of the job. When I saw it, it didn't make any sense to me, but I decided to run with it. And it was a monumental failure. We interviewed 4 people, and after 2 hours of deliberation, I just said, I'm pulling the plug. None of them's good enough. We're going to have to re-specify the job and go back out. And I shouldn't have trusted them. I'm too anal to have trusted them, and I should have gone with my instincts of what I thought we needed.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
You probably have to ask people who work with me to know whether I actually am. Thing is, I've seen so much over 23 years that there's just no situation a school faces that I haven't come across. And so when a school is sitting there, like the one I chaired, it had its first ever permanent exclusion. I was able to advise the head on how to do it, to make sure that she had the best chance of the governors approving her decision. And I think I can now fairly confidently say, with the exception of financial fraud, there's not really anything I haven't come across. So I think that's what makes me valuable, that people can look to me and say, well, what have you come across, Ian, or what have you done in this situation? And I can normally adduce an example or analogize from an example.
Definitely have to get you onto the New Role community so that you can share that experience with other members of the New Role community who are facing some of those challenges for the first time. Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Okay. So, first one, hopefully they take away that volunteering in education is both profound and rewarding. And it will enhance their professional life, I believe, and deliver what I call work balance. And if I could just expand on that, before I retired from the commercial world, I was a speechwriter for European business people who had to give a speech in English when it wasn't their native tongue. And I'd work hard and I was pretty well remunerated. But in the end, when a speech is given, it's ephemeral and it's gone into the ether. But this has something lasting about it and is rich because of it. So that's one. Two, I think all our state-funded schools need an injection of strategic nous, the ability to analyze data penetratingly, and some experience, hopefully, of implementational verve. And if people have got that, they can make a real difference pretty quickly, I think. And finally, what I think I'd say is that investing time and expertise in our schools and colleges creates the opportunity for a rich return in investment through tangible impact and meaningful legacy. And I really would invite everybody to think the extent to which they can say that about their day jobs.
And that's a rousing call to arms. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
It's been an immense pleasure, and thank you for your interest.
If you're feeling stuck and want to move into more ambitious board roles, Neural Plus gives you expert support to sharpen your value and open more doors. As a listener, you get 10% off. Head to plus.neural.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.